October 1837, Blackwater Bay, Nova Scotia. The curse of Blackwater Bay was something that everyone in the village knew about, but no one spoke of openly. It was a dark stain on the history of the place, a legend that kept most fishermen away, but not Henri the Hound Laurent. He had spent years running from his past, the crimes he committed as a pirate, and he believed that maybe the bay could offer him a new start, or at least a fortune worth risking it all. He was a man desperate to escape his demons, and he thought the rumored riches hidden beneath the waves would be the key to his redemption. But Henri had no idea that the bay held far more than just gold. It held a curse, one that would bring his darkest fears to life. Henry wasn't alone in his ambition. James McTavish, an ambitious young fisherman, had heard tales of the riches hidden beneath the dark waters of Blackwater Bay. The whispers of pirate gold, lost when a ship went down in 1785, had always fascinated him. Despite the stories of disappearances and curses, James wanted to see for himself what lay beneath the waves. He had always been drawn to the unknown, his curiosity often getting the better of him. When Henry approached him about the journey, James was eager to join, believing it would be his chance to make a name for himself and leave behind the mundane life of a fisherman. Sophie Voss, the herbalist's daughter, was also on board, though no one knew it at first. She had stowed away, determined to prove herself capable in a world dominated by men. Fishing was not something that women were allowed to do, but Sophie had no intention of following the rules. She hid below deck, her eyes wide with excitement and a hint of fear. She had always been fascinated by the sea, and the chance to be part of something bigger than herself was too tempting to pass up. She knew the risks, but she also knew that this could be her only opportunity to prove herself, to show that she was just as capable as any man. It didn't take long for things to take a dark turn. Henry convinced the crew to drop anchor at the rumored spot of buried treasure, and when they hauled in their nets, they found something that made everyone pause. A piece of jewelry, gold and encrusted with gems, was tangled in the net, wrapped around a skeletal hand. The sight of it sent a shiver down the spine of everyone aboard, even Henri, but he laughed it off, shaking his head as he tucked the jewelry away. "Just a piece of history," he said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak up. They all knew the stories, but greed and ambition kept them from turning back. The unease only grew as the days went on. Every haul they brought in seemed fine at first. The fish were lively, their scales glistening, but as soon as they hit the deck, they began to rot, their flesh turning black and foul. The stench was overwhelming, a putrid smell that seemed to cling to everything. Sophie, still hiding below, noticed that the air seemed heavy, almost rancid. But when she asked one of the crew if they could smell it too, they just shook their head, oblivious to the stench. It was as if the bay itself was trying to warn them, but they refused to listen. James, usually confident and full of energy, started to change as well. He became distracted, his eyes distant, his face pale. He confessed to Sophie that he had begun hearing voices, whispers that seemed to come from the water, calling his name. One night she found him standing at the edge of the boat, his eyes fixed on the dark waves below, his body swaying as if he were about to jump. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back just in time, but the fear in his eyes spoke volumes. "They're calling me," he whispered. "The cursed crew. They want me to join them." Sophie could see the fear in his eyes, and for the first time, she felt truly afraid. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it wanted them. Henri, however, was determined to press on. He refused to let the crew turn back. Even as tensions rose, and the fear among the men became palpable. He needed that gold. It was the only way to make up for his past, to finally escape the life he had led. He believed that if they could just find the treasure, everything would be worth it. But James had had enough. The two men came to blows one night, each one blaming the other for the misfortune that had befallen them. Henri accused James of cowardice, while James shouted that Henri's greed was going to kill them all. The crew watched in silence, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. They all knew that something was wrong, that the bay was not going to let them leave, but they were too afraid to speak up. But it wasn't just their own actions turning against them. The bay itself seemed alive, the currents twisting and pulling, refusing to let the boat leave. Every time they tried to turn back, the water dragged them in deeper, the waves crashing against the hull, as if the bay itself wanted them to stay. The winds howled, the sky darkening with ominous clouds, and the water seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Sophie could feel the fear in her bones, the whispers growing louder, the air colder. She knew they had to leave, but it felt like the bay was alive, holding them captive. In the end, it was too much. The crew made one last desperate attempt to escape, the sails straining against the wind, the boat creaking as if it would break apart. The fear was palpable, the men working in silence, their faces pale and drawn. As they finally began to pull away from the cursed waters, they looked back and saw them, ghostly figures standing on the surface of the bay, their faces twisted in anger and sorrow. Their eyes followed the boat, their mouths moving in whispers that only James could hear. He covered his ears, his face contorted in fear, but the whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. Henri, driven mad by the sight, let out a scream and ran to the edge of the boat. Before anyone could stop him, he jumped overboard, disappearing into the dark water below. The crew watched in horror as the waves swallowed him, the ghostly figures fading into the mist. The air grew still, an eerie silence falling over the bay. It was as if the bay had taken what it wanted, and now it was letting them go. There was no treasure, no fortune to be found in Blackwater Bay, only curses and lost souls. The remaining crew, along with James and Sophie, finally made it back to shore, their hearts heavy, their minds haunted by what they had seen. No one spoke of what had happened, but the village knew. They could see it in the eyes of those who returned, the fear, the loss. Blackwater Bay was cursed, and now they had proof. The villagers kept their distance, whispering among themselves, the story spreading like wildfire. Henri was never seen again, his body lost to the depths, and with him went any hope of treasure. The story of that night became another whispered warning, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and that the past never truly stays buried. Sophie returned to her life as the herbalist's daughter, but she was never the same. She could still hear the whispers at night, still see the ghostly figures in her dreams. James left the village unable to bear the weight of what had happened. He traveled from town to town, trying to outrun the memories, but they followed him, a constant reminder of the night they tempted fate and lost. The curse of Blackwater Bay lived on, a dark reminder of the dangers of greed and the price of disturbing the past. The bay remained quiet, the water calm, but the villagers knew better. They knew that beneath the surface, the spirits of the past were waiting, watching, ready to claim anyone foolish enough to seek the cursed treasure of Blackwater Bay. And so, the bay was left undisturbed, a place of dark legends and whispered warnings, a reminder that some things are best left forgotten. Story 2. April 1891, Loch Morar, Scotland. The legend of Morag, the mythical creature of Loch Morar, was one that kept most fishermen away from its depths. The stories had been passed down for generations, tales of a siren's song that lured men to their doom, leaving nothing but empty boats floating on the water. Finlay MacGregor, a respected elder and fisherman, had always believed in the stories. He knew better than to venture into the deeper waters, but his beliefs were about to be put to the test in a way he never imagined. Finlay had agreed to take Colin Drummond, a scholar with a fascination for folklore, out on the loch for a fishing trip. Colin had come to the village specifically to document the legends of Loch Morar, eager to debunk them and prove that they were nothing more than superstitious nonsense. He was confident that he could explain away every mysterious occurrence with science and reason. Finlay had his doubts, but he agreed to take Colin out, if only to prove to him that some things were best left alone. Finley felt a deep sense of unease, but he couldn't let Colin go out there alone. It was too dangerous. He needed to be there to protect the scholar from his own ignorance. Joining them was Eyelid Campbell, Finley's niece. She was sharp-witted and brave, fascinated by her uncle's stories, but also skeptical of the supernatural. She believed that most legends had a basis in truth, but she wasn't convinced that a mythical creature lurked beneath the surface of Loch Morar. She was determined to see for herself what lay beneath the dark waters, and to protect her uncle from any harm that might come their way. Eyelid had always been curious, and she saw this as an opportunity to experience something extraordinary. The idea of uncovering a hidden truth excited her, even if it meant confronting her own fears. The first day on the loch was calm. The water was still, and the sky was clear. The trio cast their lines, waiting for the fish to bite. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. Every line they dropped came back empty, as if something beneath the surface was devouring the bait before they could catch anything. The bait itself looked untouched, almost as if it had simply vanished. Finley grew anxious, his eyes darting toward the deeper waters. He told Colin they should leave, that the loch was warning them to stay away. But Colin dismissed his fears, insisting they stay longer. He was determined to find proof that the loch's legends were nothing more than superstition. Colin's skepticism bordered on arrogance, and he couldn't help but laugh at the tension on Finley's face. That evening, as the sun began to set, a thick fog rolled in from the east, enveloping them in a dense gray shroud. The shore disappeared from view, and the loch seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Finley's unease grew, his hands gripping the oars tightly as he tried to navigate them back to shore. But the fog was too thick, and they had lost their bearings. The sense of disorientation was palpable, and the silence around them felt almost unnatural. Colin, still trying to rationalize the situation, claimed it was just a natural phenomenon, a result of the changing weather. But Finley knew better. He had seen this fog before, and it always meant the same thing. The loch was alive, and it wanted something from them. As night fell, Eyelid began to hear something, a faint, melodic singing that seemed to come from beneath the water. At first she thought she was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was beautiful, haunting, and it seemed to be calling her name. She glanced at her uncle, who was staring at the water with a look of pure terror. "It's her," he whispered. "Morag's song. She's calling us." Finley's voice trembled, and his fear was infectious. The dread in his eyes made Eyelid's heart pound, her skepticism faltering. Eyelid tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just the wind, just the waves. But then she saw it, a massive dark shape moving beneath the boat, a shadow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the song. The water rippled around them and the boat began to sway. The movement felt unnatural, as if something beneath was deliberately shifting the boat. Colin, still skeptical, leaned over the edge, trying to get a better look. But as he did, the singing grew louder, and his eyes glazed over, his body leaning further and further over the side. His expression shifted from curiosity to something almost entranced. "Colin!" Eyelid screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. He blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and looked at her, confused. I heard her," he muttered. "She wants me to come to her." His voice was distant, and his eyes seemed to be looking past her, as if still caught in the spell. Finley, his face pale, began to chant softly in Gaelic, his voice trembling as he recited the words his father had taught him. It was a prayer, a plea to the spirits of the loch to let them go. The rhythmic chant seemed to battle the melody, creating an eerie dissonance that hung in the air. The fog thickened, the air growing colder, and the boat began to spin, caught in a whirlpool that seemed to have formed beneath them. The water churned, the waves crashing against the sides of the boat. Eyelid held onto the edge, her knuckles white, as Finley's chant grew louder, more desperate. The shadow beneath them moved closer, the singing reaching a deafening pitch. It felt as though the loch itself was alive, pulling them towards its depths. The boat groaned under the strain, the wood creaking as if it might splinter at any moment. Just when it seemed like the boat would capsize, The fog began to lift. The singing faded, the water growing calm once more. The sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Finley's voice trailed off, his eyes closed in relief. The boat drifted, the shore slowly coming back into view. They had made it. They had escaped, but the lock had taken its toll. The air was still heavy, the sense of unease lingering. It was as if the lock was allowing them to leave, but only just. Colin sat in silence, his face pale, his hands trembling. He no longer had any desire to prove the legends wrong. He had heard the song, seen the shadow, felt the pull of the lock's power. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by a deep-seated fear. Eileith, too, was shaken. She had always believed in the power of stories, but now she knew that some stories were real, that some legends were born from truth. She could still hear the echo of the song in her mind, and the memory of the shadow haunted her. As they finally reached the shore, Finley stepped out of the boat, his legs unsteady. He looked out at the lock, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and respect. "The lock is alive," he said quietly, "and it will take what it wants. We're lucky it let us go." His words hung in the air, a solemn reminder of the danger they had faced. The lock had spared them, but only just. The experience had left a mark on all of them, one that would not fade easily. The story of that night became another tale whispered among the villagers, a warning to those who dared to venture into the deeper waters of Loch Morar. Finley never returned to the loch, and Colin left the village, unable to face the memories of what had happened. He abandoned his research, his desire to debunk the supernatural replaced by an understanding that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Eileith, though still curious, knew better than to tempt fate. She had heard the siren's call, and she knew that the loch would always be watching, waiting for its next victim. She could never forget the feeling of the loch's pull, the sense that it was alive and aware of their presence. The curse of Loch Morar lived on, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, that some legends are real, and that the past never truly dies. The loch remained quiet, its waters still, but beneath the surface, Morag waited, her song ready to lure in anyone foolish enough to listen. The villagers avoided the deeper waters, their respect for the loch now mingled with fear. And so, the legend continued, a warning passed down through generations, a reminder of the night the loch had almost claimed 3 more souls, and of the power that still lurked beneath its dark waters. Story 3. June 1883, Everglades, Florida. The swamps were thick with the buzz of insects and the heat of the summer sun, the kind of heat that made even the bravest men sweat. Zeke Carver, an old southern fisherman with a past as murky as the waters they sailed, was determined to catch something that would bring him fame and fortune. The rumors had started weeks ago. A massive golden fish was said to be lurking in the Everglades, a fish so rare it could fetch a small fortune. Zeke needed that money. He had debts to pay, and he had his nephew Jed to look after. Jed was young, inexperienced, but eager to prove himself, and Zeke was going to give him the chance. Mose, the preacher. Carter, a religious fisherman known for his fiery sermons and strict moral code, had also heard the rumors. He was Zeke's rival, and the two men had never seen eye to eye. Mose believed Zeke was a sinner, a man who had done wrong and never repented. But Mose wanted that fish too, and he wasn't about to let Zeke get to it first. The Everglades were dangerous, filled with gators and snakes, but Mose believed that God would protect him. He had faith, and he had his hooks, which he called the Lord's instruments. The two men set out on the same day, each determined to catch the golden fish before the other. Jed sat in Zeke's boat, his eyes wide with excitement and a hint of fear. He had never been this far into the swamp before, and the stories his uncle told him about the dangers of the Everglades echoed in his mind. Zeke, on the other hand, was focused, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. He knew Mose was out there somewhere, and he wasn't about to let the preacher get the better of him. The journey into the swamp was treacherous. The boat cut through narrow waterways, surrounded by tall grasses and twisting mangroves. The deeper they went, The more oppressive the atmosphere became, the insects seemed louder, the water darker. Jed couldn't help but feel uneasy, but he kept his eyes forward, trying to mimic his uncle's determination. Zeke's face was set in a grim expression, and every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to see Moses' boat tailing them. As the sun began to set, Zeke spotted it, a flash of gold beneath the water, a shimmer that made his heart race. He cast his line, his hands steady, his eyes locked on the spot where he had seen the fish. Mose, not far away, saw it too. He cast his line, the two men now in direct competition. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds the buzzing of insects and the splashing of their lines hitting the water. Jed watched, his heart pounding. He wanted to prove himself to his uncle, to show that he could be a man, that he could handle the swamp. He cast his own line, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Moses' line jerked, and he began to reel it in. But when he pulled it from the water, his hook was twisted and bent, as if something had taken hold of it and tried to tear it apart. Moses' face darkened, and he glared at Zeke. "The devil's cursed your hooks, Carver," he spat. "Your sins have brought this on us." Zeke laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Ain't no devil here, preacher. Just a fish that don't want to be caught." But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that he couldn't shake. The two men argued, their voices rising above the noise of the swamp, each blaming the other for their failure to catch the fish. The argument grew more heated, each man shouting over the other, their anger echoing across the swamp. Jed tried to stay focused on his line, but his hands were shaking. He had never seen his uncle this worked up, and the tension in the air was suffocating. Suddenly there was a splash, and Jed cried out. He had hooked something, but it wasn't a fish. An alligator thrashed at the end of his line, its powerful tail whipping the water, its jaws snapping. Jed's eyes went wide with fear, and he struggled to hold onto the rod. Zeke moved quickly, grabbing a pole and striking the gator, trying to drive it away. The creature let go, disappearing beneath the water. But the commotion had drawn attention. The water around them began to ripple, more gators drawn by the noise and the scent of blood. "We need to get out of here," Jed said, his voice trembling. Zeke nodded, his eyes scanning the water. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the swamp was growing darker by the minute. The shadows lengthened, and a thick, unnatural fog began to roll in, enveloping them. The air grew colder, and Zeke felt a chill run down his spine. He had been in the Everglades his whole life, but he had never seen fog like this. It was as if the swamp itself was trying to swallow them whole. Moses' voice cut through the fog. "This is your doing, Carver. The Lord is punishing you for your sins." Zeke ignored him, his focus on finding a way out. But the fog was thick, and they had lost their bearings. Every direction looked the same, and the maze-like waterways twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the swamp. The tension between the two men grew, each blaming the other for their predicament, their fear turning to anger. Jed felt caught between them, his heart pounding as the fog seemed to press in on all sides. The once familiar waterways were now an endless maze, and every rustle, every splash made his skin crawl. Then, just as the fog seemed to be at its thickest, Zeke saw it again. The golden fish, its scales shimmering beneath the surface. He felt a surge of determination, his hands steady as he cast his line once more. The hook caught, and the line went taut, the boat jerking as the fish pulled them forward. Zeke gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he fought to reel it in. The boat rocked, water splashing over the sides, the fish pulling them towards deeper waters. The fog seemed to swirl around them, the shadows dancing across the surface of the water, and the sound of the line straining filled the air. "Let it go, Zeke!" Jed shouted, his voice filled with fear. But Zeke couldn't. He was too close, the gold just within his grasp. He could almost feel the fortune slipping through his fingers. Mose, seeing the danger, grabbed a knife and cut the line. The tension snapped, the boat lurching as the fish disappeared into the murky water. Zeke turned on Mose, his face twisted with rage. "You fool! I had it!" But Mose just shook his head. "You'd have killed us all, Carver. That fish ain't worth our lives." The fog began to lift, the swamp slowly coming back into focus. The boat drifted, the tension between the men palpable. They had come for the golden fish, but they had found something far more dangerous. The swamp had shown them its power, and it had nearly cost them their lives. As they made their way back to the shore, each man was silent, their faces grim. They had failed, but they had survived. And in the Everglades, that was all that mattered. The journey back to the shore was slow and exhausting. The fog had lifted, but the darkness remained, and the sounds of the swamp seemed louder, more menacing. The splash of an unseen creature, the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of a bullfrog. It all felt different now, as if the swamp was watching them, waiting for another chance to strike. Zeke's hands were sore from gripping the oars, his muscles aching. Jed sat in the back of the boat, his eyes wide, his face pale. He had wanted adventure, but this was more than he had bargained for. Mose, sitting at the front of the boat, kept his eyes on the horizon, his lips moving in silent prayer. He had always believed in the power of God, but tonight he had seen something else, something dark and powerful, something that didn't care about their faith or their rivalry. The swamp was alive, and it had a will of its own. He could still feel the weight of the fog, the pull of the water, the eerie shimmer of the golden fish. It was a reminder that there were forces in the world that couldn't be tamed or understood. The story of the golden fish became another tale whispered among the fishermen, a warning to those who dared to venture too deep into the swamp. Zeke and Mose never spoke of what had happened, but the rivalry between them was gone, replaced by a mutual respect for the power of the Everglades. They both knew that they had been lucky to make it out alive. Jed, though still eager to prove himself, had learned a valuable lesson, that the swamp was not a place to be taken lightly, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply making it out alive. In the weeks that followed, Jed found himself unable to shake the memories of that night. He would wake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the sound of the fog swirling in his ears. He tried to talk to his uncle about it, but Zeke would just shake his head and tell him to forget it. "The swamp's got its secrets, boy. Best not to dwell on them." But Jed couldn't help it. He had seen the golden fish, felt the pull of something beyond his understanding.